100 days videos, biome challenges, skyblocks, all ideas shamelessly borrowed from a certain blog game we shall not name. But what if we stole just one more idea? The concept of a forever world. That was the question I asked myself when I first conceptualized the Plains and Valleys world. And now here we are, 3 installments deep in what was always meant to be my forever world. A place to grow, build, and return to for years to come. In the first installment, I spawned into a brand new world, picked a place to settle, and got mauled by every bear in existence. But I still managed to climb the tech tree while building my so-called starter house. In the second installment, things went off the rails. I poured an absurd number of hours into constructing this 50,000 block monstrosity, while still getting routinely mauled by a certain mammal. Now we're here. There's a lot to do. The Megabuild factory, while impressive, still sat empty and unused. My supply of tools and materials was at its lowest since the first episode, and the new endgame story locations were taunting me with their mysteries. And of course, there was a new massive build to tackle, because, let's face it, at this point it's basically a tradition. Tired of watching me abandon worlds before diving into the deep end? Then join me for a third installment of this journey, codename Plains, Valleys, and the Forever World. It was nice to be back to the world of Plains and Valleys. After doing a short tour of my base and taking stock of my inventory, I went into the kitchen to set myself up with 2 cooking pots worth of spelt porridge. I was not going to get far on an empty stomach. Once my satiety needs were taken care of, it was time to start tackling a list of projects slated for the next 100 days. First project on the list was animal husbandry. For this, I would need to capture local wildlife, of course, and to capture wildlife I would need cages. Cages required copper ingots, and I only had a single ingot ready to go. So I smelted 3 more copper ingots to take care of that problem. While the ingots were cooling off, I crafted fencing and started working on an enclosure close to my house. This, however, will only be a temporary solution. My culminating project for this playthrough would involve building something a lot nicer and a lot bigger. I crafted and placed a series of large troughs, placed a double gate, and returned to the house to grab the ingots. Meanwhile, I learned how to drink water for the first time. I installed the hydrate or dihydrate mod in order to add a bit of extra challenge. When my thirst was quenched, I crafted 4 large animal cages while using improved handbook recipes mod. The mod allowed me to paste the recipes into the crafting grid without having to memorize them at all. Before heading out, I stopped by the back balcony of my house and enjoyed the sight of my mega build from the previous episode. I was ready to head out, but my plans were interrupted by a temporal storm. I was done cowering in panic shelter every time one appeared, however, so I enabled the ability to sleep through these storms instead. I quickly ran into the bedroom and played dead while the storm passed. This somehow fooled the shivers crawling all over the place and they left me alone. The morning came and a brilliant light was coming through my window while the horrors of the last night quickly faded into obscurity. I set off to capture some wild pigs, going clockwise around the lake. Shortly, I found a female on the other side of the lake. However, my attempt to capture her resulted in her demise as she chose death over captivity.
Stay with us. Would you like that?
I'm gonna be free or die.
Maybe it was bad karma, but I didn't have much luck finding any more pigs. I kept walking further and further northeast until I ran into my first bear, as customary for my Plains and Valleys series. It seemed that the bears always messed up my early game, and this was no exception. I took a few swings to see if fighting was an option, but only further angered him, which resulted in my demise. While running to recover my body, I suddenly started discovering a pig, after a pig, after a pig. I should have gone counterclockwise in the first place, that was obvious by now. After marking all of the sightings on my map, I made it to my body. If you're wondering why my body was a skeleton and not just a bunch of items scattered around, I was using the player corpse mod at this point. This will be a staple in my modded playthroughs going forward. Once I got my body back, I knew exactly where to go to get my piggies. And shortly, I had 3 females and a single male captured in the 4 cages I crafted earlier. On the way back, I got to enjoy an insane sunset over the mountains. Sure was pretty. I slapped the cages side by side and released the piggies into the respective pen. I filled the troughs with tasty feed and left them to their own devices. I spread a few lanterns around the pen, since I would be coming here often, and had about a dozen lanterns collecting dust in the chest. With animal husbandry taken care of, it was time to acquire quote-unquote endgame gear. The new 1.20 update introduced the next tier of backpacks with 8 slots each, a clear upgrade over my 6-slotted leather backpacks. For someone who values inventory space above everything else, these were a must-have. The requirements to craft them were incredibly steep, however. The first step in the journey was to find chromite, an ore that was pretty much worthless until now. While my prospecting data was now gone due to version migration, I had a distinct memory of seeing chromite in the iron-rich northwestern quadrant of my map. So off I went. This was perhaps the most anticlimactic search, as literally my second prospecting result returned a chromite reading. On top of that, I also got an ultra-high iron reading as well, the highest amount I have ever seen to date. I would use this knowledge later. I settled on a spot a little further east. I ran into a decent reading of chromite and decided it was worth pursuing. In a typical fashion, I went straight down while prospecting every 10 blocks or so. Around Y40, I hit a trace reading of chromite. It was just a matter of triangulating the location by digging in each cardinal direction. Southern direction ended up being the winner. A minute later, I was staring at a chromite deposit. There was more than enough chromite here for my needs. Here, I got to put my first point into the mining skill. I was now running Xskills mod to keep things more interesting during this playthrough. On the way out, I encountered a lot of local opposition who forced me to retreat into the mine. I had to find a different way out. While digging a fresh shaft out of the mine, I stumbled on a good reading of copper and decided might as well snag some copper. There was more copper here than I could mine in a single session, so I continued to mine until I ran into the new rate limiting factor when it came to underground exploration. The hydration level was pretty hard to maintain in the relatively hot underground caves, and this was just in the early spring. By the time I hit the surface, I was already getting familiar with the dehydrate concept of the mod. Luckily, I emerged right by a small lake and quenched my thirst quickly. Thirst would be a constant concern underground going forward. Next goal, towards increasing my inventory with the new packs, was getting sulfur. Once again, I had no prospecting data saved, but had a pretty good intuitive understanding where all the minerals were. After all, I was over 160 hours deep into this world. So I mounted a raft and once again crossed the infamous lake to go towards a much smaller one in a large sedimentary area directly north. The journey was uneventful, and once I arrived at the murky blue lake, I started fishing for sulfur. Once again, my streak of easily finding rare minerals continued. I found traces of sulfur underneath a small lake to the west. I dove into the briskly cold water and dug into the lake's bottom. A dozen blocks underneath the lake, a large quantity of sulfur was picked up by my prospecting pick, and just like that, my sulfur needs were met. I mined out every single bit of sulfur from the surrounding rock and moved on. Once there was nothing else to mine, I emerged into the middle of the lake and started on the journey home. No bears stood in my way this time, and I safely crossed the lake and returned home with no incident. There was no rest for the wicked, however. The next resource on the menu was saltpeter. This one ended up being a lot more troublesome. Most caves around my base stood pristine and unexplored. I had little reason to engage in cave exploration up to this point. Thus, I had little to no intel on the underground real estate nearby. Shortly, I found a big hole that seemed to disappear into the nether and started my descent. It wasn't too long before I spotted saltpeter on the walls. It looked deceivingly easy to acquire. I tunneled further down through the periodite and attempted to enter the cave. What I opened though was a gate from hell.
You take me, you leave them alone.
No. There is no escape.
The gateway is open, and you are all coming with me.
Immediately, drifters started pouring out of the opening. This spooked me a bit, and I retreated into the safety. I ran home to grab some ladders and tunneled my way down directly to the saltpeter cave. I made sure to place ladders on the way down for easy access. I made it back to the original opening and rounded the corner once again, only to be met with a ton of opposition. I should have abandoned this forsaken place at this point, but the sunk cost fallacy had already set in. Trying to fight head-on was a fool's errand, however. My alternate plan was to torch up the place in hopes of despawning the drifters. I foolishly ran into the cave with all my gear, only to realize the gravity of the situation. The cave was crawling with drifters, bolt horns, and shivers, like something out of the Indiana Jones movie.
Oh, I broke a nail.
Needless to say, I did not last long in this cave. At least my torches were in place and the baddies would despawn now, right? Unfortunately, they didn't get the memo. The room was still filled to the brim with horror. I made another mad dash attempt to recover my body and came pretty darn close to being able to do so. But pretty close wasn't going to cut it, now was it? I wasn't sure why things weren't despawning. Was it my misunderstanding of the spawning mechanics, or was it some 1.20 bug? Regardless, I soon realized that my gear was fucked. In good news, the only thing of value on my body were the leather bags. In bad news, I still needed saltpeter for the bag replacements. My next course of attack was to start caving in a low stakes manner with flint tools in hopes of locating an easy source of saltpeter. This went about as good as you would imagine. I got horribly lost in the very first cave I went into. I saw no other choice but to let drifters send me back to the surface. I couldn't even get inside the next cave. A bear must have seen me as an easy prey and savagely chased me until I was dead, despite my best efforts to lose him. When I did get into the cave, I was rewarded with a sight of saltpeter. I felt my mood lifting before realizing I did not bring enough soil to climb out of the vertical shaft, which forced me to employ the services of the local drifters once more. Nothing was going my way, and I was not having that much fun. I did come back to the hole and successfully recovered my body, after which I successfully ascended by pillaring with a stack of soil. Good news, I was finally in possession of some saltpeter. Bad news, it was nowhere near enough for 4 bags. Nevertheless, I could sense the winds of fortune shifting my way. A random cave nearby was a golden ticket of easy-to-access saltpeter. The saltpeter was at a shallow depth, and thus there were no tier 4 baddies guarding it. It did require a bit of scaffolding work to get access to, but outside of that, it was a piece of cake. It would have been nice to find this cave initially, but hindsight 2020. Regardless, I was ready to move on to the next ingredient, the animal hides. I couldn't afford to run the process with large hides. They required the same raw materials for half the output compared to the huge hides. This meant grabbing my steel shield and a steel axe and chopping down a few bears. It was my turn to spread terror around the local bear population. Luckily, I knew all the spots.
Father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and I will have my vengeance. In this life or the next.
The sweet scent of revenge permeated the air that day. Finally, I had all the ingredients for sturdy leather. The first step was to process the hides in diluted borax. I filled the barrels with 50 liters of water, found some borax to grind, placed it in the barrels to make diluted borax, and after repeating the process with another barrel, I shuffled huge hides into them. While waiting on the leatherworking process to finish, I converted the last few blooms in my possession into the pounder caps for the pulverizer. Chromite, of course, required tier 4 pounder caps to be pulverized. I grabbed stored pulverizer components from a chest and walked to the Megabuild to finally get some use out of it. This was going to be an extremely here and now type of setup. It wasn't pretty, and not what I envisioned for this Megabuild by the end, but considering I was now bagless, I was willing to settle. I left the pulverizer to work on chromite and returned home to collect huge soaked hides from the barrels, which I then scraped with a knife. Next, it was time to make sulfuric acid. I ground sulfur into a powdered form and combined water, saltpeter, and sulfur into 2 cooking pots. Now, it was just a matter of cooking this unholy concoction. I ran back to the pulverizer and grabbed pulverized chromite out of the reed basket. The crushed chromite was added into the pot with sulfuric acid to make chromium sulfate. Next, I combined the chromium sulfate with scrapped hides and cooked that to produce chromium-treated hides. Now, it was just a matter of intense repetition. Cooking sulfuric acid, converting that into chromium sulfate, and cooking my hides in that hot mess. And if you thought that sounded complex, there was one more step to go. The chromium-treated hides needed to cook with a massive amount of beeswax to finally produce sturdy leather. Sturdy leather, of course, could be crafted into sturdy backpacks. Crafting in the grid was the simple part, and soon I had 4 Endgame backpacks ready to go. Who needed those 4 leather backpacks rotting on a corpse in the underground hellhole? Not this guy. Crafting these bags was a massive project, but it was time to go even bigger. My mega factory was sitting mostly empty and idling. It was time to get it fully online. First step in the process was to craft a bunch of bloomeries. Luckily, I had a shit ton of bricks left from my previous playthrough. Next, I loaded them up with iron nuggets. I had plenty of those on hand as well. The iron batch was extremely necessary. My supply of steel and iron was officially exhausted. I couldn't even produce iron tools, much less steel ones. Meanwhile, I went out to catch a few bighorns. I figured I should breed at least one milk-producing animal. Catching bighorns with the cages was quite annoying, however. They did not want to come willingly. Although eventually, I had 3 females and 1 male captured and ready to release. Before I could make an animal pen for them, I had to fix my tool situation, which was in dire straits now. I broke the bloomeries containing iron blooms, slapped them on the forges, and heated them up to spec. Next came a lengthy smithing session for all the basics: shovels, axes, and mining picks. I even needed to resmith a new blackguard sword. The one I had previously was now at the bottom of the world along with my bags. With the tool supply fixed, I could finally build out a second pen for my bighorns. Once I finished the pen, I released the trio of females and a single ram into the new enclosure. I filled the troughs with grain and left them to do it like they do on the Discovery Channel.
I'd appreciate your input.
Right after, I proceeded to engage in a multi-hour smithing session. This time around, I was converting the blooms into iron ingots for future use. Once I had a solid supply of ingots, it was time to start one of the biggest endeavors yet. My plan was to build 6 refractory furnaces in the factory, but not just any 6 furnaces utilizing Tier 3 refractory bricks. Something I've never done before, and something that required a massive amount of investment. First on the list was bauxite. Bauxite, of course, was never a problem in the Plains and Valleys world. There was plenty of it to be had across the river to the north. I must have spent an hour mining the red stone until my new sturdy leather backpacks were coming apart at the seams. I made it back home and ran to the new pulverizer setup inside one of the wind tunnels. Of course, reed baskets were not going to cut it anymore, so I replaced them with trunks and loaded the feeder chest full of bauxite stone. I decided not to wait around for process to finish, which later I learned was a huge mistake. Instead, I decided to hop on the new refractory brick ingredient. Luckily, quartz was just about everywhere. Inches from my house, I submerged into a cave and mined out a full inventory worth of quartz. This took a lot longer than mining bauxite. I also managed to get over a stack of silver ore in the process as well. I once again ascended the ladders of my Megabuild only to find out that somehow I lost over 20 stacks of bauxite. I knew that there could be potential loss in the system due to chunk unloading, but this loss was extreme. There was only one way forward, and that was copious amount of AFKing around the pulverizer until everything was processed. I was not about to lose 70% of my yield again. I employed the well-known strategy called Netflix on a secondary monitor. These pulverizer sessions were powered by Better Call Saul. Once quartz was processed, it was time to start hunting for the olivine. This was going to be a bit more complex. There was plenty of olivine under the eastern part of the lake, but it was almost at the bottom of the world, which meant nasty drifters and the previously mentioned thirst due to the excess heat. I went to the part of the lake where I previously found olivine and dug directly down using the water to descend. My memory perhaps was a bit too good because I unearthed the exact cavity where I previously mined for this material, which meant there was plenty of space for drifters to spawn. As soon as I entered, I noped the fuck out. Being traumatized from the last deep delve, I was going to play it safe. I would really hate to lose my sturdy backpacks this time. I picked a new place to dig and made it to the bottom of the world again. Finding a new olivine shelf still required a bit of searching, but eventually I did find something suitable. Thirst being this deep, however, was going to be a big issue going forward. Later, I would figure out a way to deal with it, but for now, I was drinking water from the elevator column in the dark. Having to quench my thirst this often was really killing my efficiency. However, X-Skills was bridging this gap a little bit. I spec'd into mining specialization, which allowed me to invest 3 points into the pickaxe expert, and that increased my mining speed by a lot. Soon, the mine cavity was big enough for the baddies to start spawning and messing with my flow. It would have been smart to bring some lanterns down here, but foresight was never my strong trait. What I lacked in foresight, however, I made up in sheer perseverance. Soon, I was back at the pulverizer, doing the familiar song and dance. Olivine and quartz were officially done. Unfortunately, I had to make another trip to get the bauxite. I did lose most of it during the pulverization process. I will let you guess what happened next. A bit of Zen meditation while waiting for the pulverizer output. Now that I had bauxite, quartz, and olivine, there was only 2 more components left. Titanium was the rarest of the 2 and the one I was worried about the most. I had good prospecting data for the north, east, and west, and was certain looking for titanium in those directions was not the play. South, however, was a mystery to me, and that is where I went. To my surprise, about 1,000 blocks away from my base, I got the first confirmation of titanium. After prospecting around the area, I couldn't even muster 0.5% of titanium in the best chunk, but I have worked with less. So I took the plunge of faith, a plunge into the dark and sweaty underground, where I started branch mining in hopes of finding the rare ore. The process was not going very fast, that was for sure, but eventually the prospecting pick found what I was looking for. In good news, it was also a large-sized deposit. Of course, I brought my very last steel pick to mine titanium, since it was a tier 5 ore just like chromite. Mining the slow came with expected set of challenges. I once again had to drink from my elevator shafts every few minutes, and the baddies were bad down here. But I drank, and killed, and kept on mining. Once the deposit was exhausted, I continued to branch mine even further. I needed a few more deposits before I could call it a day. This once again was an exercise in sheer perseverance. Did you guys know that Vintage Story is an extremely grindy game? But the years of farming hell cows in high school prepared me well for this moment. Tier 4 shivers were currently the scariest new addition to the game. They caused me the most problems and gave me a run for my money. Soon I was forced to escape with my life and my loot. Unfortunately, I was only half done when that happened. On the way home, I almost died from dehydration and starvation combined, but a quick drink from a puddle and a nice bowl of porridge at the buzzer helped me to stay afloat. Being tired of dealing with thirst, I collected my first harvest of berries with the goal of making wine. Apparently, alcohol was a much better way to maintain hydration. Something about Seraph's processing alcohol differently. I didn't ask too many questions and got to juicing instead. Soon, I had 200 liters worth of juice in the barrels, which I then sealed to get the fermentation process going. I almost had all of the components to craft tier 3 bricks, but of course I still had to fire them in a pit kiln. Except, now we had a new endgame tech to facilitate this process, and this tech was a beehive kiln. This new structure would allow me to fire a massive amounts of bricks all at once. Too bad I didn't have any refractory blocks to assemble it. Or did I? I had 2 refractory furnaces with partially broken bricks idling nearby since the first 100 days. It was time to put them to use by stripping them for spare parts. Shortly, both furnaces were disassembled into their fundamental components. Before I got into building, I had to smith quite a few things for the kiln. First, the kiln required a special door. The door consisted of 4 iron rods, easily smithed from the ingots, and a set of nails. Second requirement was the 4 iron hatches, and each hatch required 3 ingots. Good thing I had 32 ingots ready to go for my last smithing session. When I stepped outside to build the kiln, I was met with a pretty sunrise. After enjoying the sunrise for a bit, I placed a kiln door, which activated a ghost overlay, and I started following the outline. I placed down the 4 hatches and built out the exterior as instructed. I then built a staircase leading up to the main entrance, terminating with a small platform and a fuel chamber underneath. Next on the menu was to make mortar to form the blocks. This required making quicklime and thus required limestone. Luckily, I found a big limestone shelf around the northeastern lake in the 100 Days episode. Now, it was just a matter of running there and stacking my inventory with the white stone. At home, I ground the limestone in a quern and ran outside to get some peat. Fortunately, I had a small peat deposit right outside of my house. At home, I stuffed 2 fire pits with peat and added ground lime. Quicklime was officially cooking in my kitchen. It was taking a long time, however. To utilize this time better, I harvested my first yield of crops. It was the first summer harvest of the season. My staples were flax, cabbage, carrots, and spelt. When I was done harvesting, quicklime was finished in my kitchen. So I mixed water, quicklime, and sand in the barrel to make mortar. I managed to produce 256 units of mortar all at once. Next, I replanted my fields with a new batch of seeds. Luckily, the way I was growing the fields allowed me to indefinitely rotate the fields without having to worry about replenishing the soil. Meanwhile, things were coming together in the pursuit of Tier 3 refractory furnaces, but there was still a lot to do. Thus, I set off to find the nearest deposit of fire clay. The fun part about running a long-term world is that sometimes you get the benefits of the older patches. The world was originally created on version 1.18, and thus fireclay was easily accessible on the surface. And thank God for that. Once my fireclay needs were met, I set in motion the next phase of my plan. This required a lengthy smithing session to make a batch of iron axes. I was about to make the biggest charcoal pit of my vintage story life. No, it wasn't going to be the 11 by 11 by 11 size, but it was still going to be big by my standards anyway. I grabbed the axes and went to the south. Unfortunately, I didn't have access to redwoods or great oaks, which would make this a lot more trivial, and I had to settle for pines instead. The process was pretty simple. Chop a bunch of pines down until the inventory is full, process the pine logs into firewood until every single log was either in the inventory or overflowing on the ground. Then construct the wood pile to specification. The final dimensions did end up being 11 wide by 11 long, and after doing 2 more inventories worth of firewood, I had the first layer of the pile complete. Then it was a lot more of the same. Cut pines, process pines, and stack them. Cut pines, process pines, and stack them. Cut pines, process pines, and stack them. Just like that, layer after layer, I was constructing the pile. However, I had not yet decided what the final height was going to be. Before I could finish another layer though, I had to stop. I went through every single axe I brought with me and had to go back. At home, I fired up more forges with iron ingots and smithed another big batch of iron axes. Then I returned and continued where I left off. I spare you the details, but eventually I ended up with the 11 by 11 by 6 pile. I briefly considered doing the full 11 by 11 by 11 pit, but I was already far too burnt out to continue. Now was the time to surround this wood effigy with soil. I surrounded the sides of the pile first before covering the top. I found the exact middle with another layer of soil. Apparently, not placing the fire in the exact middle can really mess up the process. I ignited the pile and was a proud father of the biggest charcoal pile I have built to date. Things were coming together, but yet there was still a ton to do. At home, it was time to cull the piggies. The second generation had fully matured, and I saved 9 females and a single male to start Gen 3. This involved plucking them from their enclosure and placing them with the bighorns for the time being. Once I transferred enough piggies to restart the process, I equipped a shield and went Anakin inside of the enclosure.
Master Skywalker, there are too many of them. What are we going to do?
This process was violent, macabre, and a little nauseating. By the end of my rampage, the enclosure was covered in pig bodies. The air was filled with deafening silence. I proceeded to harvest every single body. I was mostly interested in the fat. I had no means of storing this much raw meat, and most was going to go to waste. I didn't have any plans for the hides either. The enclosure was now covered in bones, like a den of some legendary creature. I quickly disposed of all the evidence to not traumatize the next generation. Following, I moved the remaining pigs back into their pen and stocked up the troughs with plenty of grain. With these major tasks out of the way, it was time for another delve underground to get more titanium. This time around, I was going in a lot more prepared. More than 200 days in, I ground a batch of sulfur in a quern, and then combined ground sulfur, linen, and honey to produce 96 healing bandages. I was also going to bring a bucket of wine, only to find out that the thirst mod put a severe move speed penalty on anything above 4 liters. I settled on 4 liters for now and went back to hunting for titanium. I felt a lot better prepared for a long mining session this time around. However, it seemed that the gods decided it wasn't worth testing my metal any longer, and I stumbled upon a large deposit of titanium while digging down on the initial descent. I mined and mined and mined some more. The deposit kept on giving. At some point, I ran out of stability and was forced to escape before things got out of control. It didn't matter though, since I already had more than enough titanium for my needs. So I booked it home while the outside world kept warping in a mad dance. Dave showed up for the first time in a while to check on my progress. Then he disappeared without saying a word, but I felt he was pleased. I climbed back to the pulverizer, deposited the titanium in the feeder chest, and then patiently meditated on the progress. By the end of the session, I was ready to craft those damned Tier 3 bricks. I combined pulverized olivine, quartz, bauxite, titanium, and fire clay to make as many bricks as I had of the limiting material. The limiting material ended up being fire clay, something that was easy to fix in the Plains and Valleys world. I found another big deposit of fire clay on the southern ridge and collected another inventory's worth of the sticky substance. With the clay at hand, I came back to my stockpile of materials and finished crafting the bricks. The next limiting material ended up being titanium, but I already had 21 stacks of the bricks, more than enough for 6 furnaces. Now, it was just a matter of firing them in a beehive kiln. I loaded the bricks into the kiln for the first time. Later, I learned that you could stack the bricks all the way to the ceiling. What I was doing at the time was hardly efficient. Nonetheless, after adding firewood as fuel, I ignited the pile and my first official beehive kiln batch was underway. The next day, I collected the finished bricks and repeated the whole process again. With furnace components finally coming together, I had to start thinking about the next step. The next step involved producing 96 iron ingots. I was not about to do that by hand. Now that I had plenty of fat to make axles, I got to the exciting stage of working on a half hammer setup in my Megabuild factory. The first step was to run an axle line from each windmill into the center of each tunnel. This included both the back-facing and the front-facing windmills. Once I reached the center, I could make a 90-degree turn and run the axles into the central room of the factory. This room was going to be the main attraction of the Megabuild and where eventually all of my mechanical gadgets would reside. I had big plans for hammers, querns, pulverizers, all geared up to the highest speed, but for now I was going simple. I was going to utilize only 4 out of the 8 windmills closest to the central room. There will be enough flexibility here to scale all of this to infinity and beyond later, but that would be a project for a different episode. In the middle of the room, I slapped an iron anvil as customary. Then I placed 4 half hammers in a cross-like fashion in a very typical 4-hammer setup. The hammers would run via the 2 large gears on each side. Each large gear was connected to the 2 axles coming from their respective sides. Sure, it wasn't the most hardcore setup, but for the time being it would do just fine. I finally had my half hammer set up, but nothing to smith. So I tapped into my copious supply of fire clay bricks to make more bloomeries. Once I had the bloomeries crafted, I started cooking what was left of my once mighty stash. I would need a lot more iron blooms cooking shortly, but for now it was all I had. While the blooms were cooking, I ran to the south to tap into my charcoal pile. I wanted to see it in all its glory first, so I removed the soil blocks around and above the pile. It sure looked like a lot of coal. I equipped my shovel and started filling the inventory with coal. I was going to leave most of the coal behind and only grab 1 inventory's worth of coal for now. I could always come back for more later. First, I filled up a small chest with coal and slapped it on my back via the carry-on mod. Then, I filled the rest of the inventory and proceeded back. Now that I had plenty of coal and iron blooms, it was just a matter of putting the half hammer setup to work. So I utilized 6 forges to heat up the blooms to a working temperature and ran the hammers full blast. Eventually, I had the 96 ingots required for the first mega batch of steel. Next, I collected the last set of refractory bricks from the beehive kiln. Then, I submerged into the local granite layer to get whole granite blocks to craft the coffins. It was finally time to build the actual furnaces. The furnace placements were long decided during the creative prototyping of the mega factory. They would align with the iron doors that were built into the ledges on each side. Those iron doors weren't there just for the show. The process went as follows. Lay the grates down first, then place the coffin down on the grates to activate the overlay. After, it was a simple process of following the overlay to build out the structure. Once I finished the body of the furnace, I still had to build out the coal chambers underneath. Once I had these chambers placed, I built out a shelf that would allow me easy access to load the furnaces with coal. Finally, it was just a matter of repeating the process 2 more times. Once I had the 3rd furnace done, I engaged in some creative chiseling to make the whole setup look a bit nicer. By the end, it looked something like this. On the opposite side of the factory, I repeated the process and built another 3 furnaces. I had the design down now, and thus had a pretty good rhythm. It went a lot smoother. The fourth iron door led to the outside ledge that would allow me easy access to the front of the furnaces. While standing on one of those outside ledges, I admired the fall foliage in my little neck of the woods. It was easy to get carried away by the process, and I had to remind myself to stop and smell the roses. Now, it was just a matter of loading the coffins with coal and iron ingots and then sealing them shut. Once I did that, I went back inside and loaded the coal chambers with coal. Once I had all 6 chambers ready to go, I ignited the coal piles. And just like that, I had 6 Tier 3 refractory furnaces cooking me a massive batch of steel. I felt pretty goddamn accomplished at the moment. There was no reason to wait around and waste precious time. At the very least, I wanted to do another batch of steel right after this one was done. This was an easily solvable problem. I grabbed my mining gear and ran to the chunk I found earlier. This chunk was prospected and showed an ultra high reading of iron, which was a ridiculous result. I have never seen anything higher, so with confidence I made a shaft and soon discovered a bountiful deposit. It was time to go to town. Here I finally put the last point into the careful miner. I was now 3 out of 3 careful miner, which made my pick last a lot longer, and 3 out of 3 pickaxe expert, which gave me a big mining speed boost. I was officially a lean, mean mining machine. On top of that, I had officially worked out how to solve the thirst issue. I ended up disabling the carrying penalty for the thirst mod. The 4-liter limit felt arbitrary and overly punishing. Now, I could just carry around buckets full of tasty wine to keep me hydrated. It also improved my Seraph's mood as a bonus. By the time I was finished mining, the mine was a complete maze and I could barely find the exit. I escaped to the surface with 15 stacks of iron. This of course meant that I could spin up more bloomeries in my factory. I still had a healthy supply of fire clay bricks to keep the process going full blast. Meanwhile, the first batch of coal was fully depleted in the refractory furnaces, so I loaded the next round of coal and ignited the piles once again. While waiting for the steel process to finish, I could focus on homesteading. A batch of berries came to fruition once more and I harvested my bushes. I juiced the berries in the fruit press and placed them in the barrels to ferment. By the end, I had another 200 liters of wine brewing, which was now exclusively my drink of choice to meet my hydration needs. I also harvested my third batch of staples: cabbage, spelt, flax, and of course carrots. I didn't bother replanting again. The fall was in full swing, and freezing temperatures were not that far behind, and I was fully set to endure the winter. I went back to the bloomeries and busted them open with a pickaxe. I immediately transitioned to working the blooms while waiting to reload my furnaces with coal. As soon as I could, I loaded the furnaces with a third batch of coal. Next, I smithed a bunch of nails with the help of the health hammers and crafted a bunch of double chests. The chests were meant for a staging area in the brand new project. You didn't honestly think I would end this video without an extra large build of some sort now, did ya? Now that I had the storage situation resolved, I set off to the south to acquire the first material. This one was easy. Pine wood was it, and it was everywhere. So I started working through the orange tinted trees until my inventory was bursting with the wood. Then I ran back past my partially abandoned coal pile and dropped off the wood in the staging area. Next, I collected the beeswax from the hives and replaced them with the freshly crafted skeps. Meanwhile, this got me through the third charcoal firing. I stuffed the furnaces with the fourth batch of coal. With the free time on my hands, I got going on the second resource for my project, and that resource would be polished granite. So, I returned to the old granite quarry from the second episode. This quarry, of course, was a massive cavity from the previous Megabuild project. It was probably not the smartest place to mine for granite. The place was dark and open and thus swarming with drifters, but at least there were the low-tier variety. I quickly disposed of them and proceeded to quarry the granite stone en masse. I settled for 10 large slabs. I took these slabs to my factory and heated up a bunch of iron ingots to make finishing chisels. Once I had the chisels, I set down the slabs and went to town producing polished granite. When I was done, I deposited the polished granite in the staging area, which resulted in about 34 stacks of granite. At the end of this process, my steel batch was ready to receive the last load of coal. At this time I realized I was forgetting something important. While I was about to have all the steel in the world to make my armor, I had no leather to make jerkin. Leather jerkin was of course a requirement to produce chainmail, which is what I was going to settle for in terms of armor. So I proceeded to fill a bunch of barrels with water. Then I filled 6 of the barrels with oak logs to start making weak tannin. The other 3 I filled with ground limestone to make lime water. The next order of business was to acquire a bunch of animal hides. Luckily, I now had Gen 3 of the piggies fully bred. This meant that the cleaver was now an option to make short work of this task. Shortly, I sealed the barrels full of lime water with the pig hides and let them do their thing. At this point, I was ready to start working on the next material for my project. Blue clay bricks would be this material. I have seen a lot of complaints on Reddit about blue clay being elusive in the 1.20 update, but a large portion of my world was generated in the previous 2 patches. Thus, blue clay was abundant in my immediate area. Once I filled up on blue clay and grid crafted the bricks, I stuffed the beehive kiln full of them. A bit of fuel, and the first batch of bricks was cooking. Meanwhile, a momentous occasion was upon me. The first official batch of steel was done cooking in my mega factory. I busted open the granite coffins full of steel blooms and immediately processed them into ingots. This was of course a pretty quick process. With the ingots, I started hammering out the chains necessary for a full set of steel chainmail. I also smithed a steel shield, a steel forks, and produced a whole slew of steel tools. Once the steel equipment was taken care of, I began working on more iron blooms. I needed 96 more of those suckers for another batch of steel. Meanwhile, I kept up with the blue brick production by visiting the beehive kiln occasionally. A bunch of time passed, and I had enough ingots to restart all 6 refractory furnaces. Of course, I didn't forget about the leather processing either. I scrapped the hides once they were done cooking in lime water and placed them in the weak tannin. Meanwhile, I started brewing strong tannin in the other 3 barrels. Eventually, the hides also made it into the strong tannin as well. A batch of leather would fall not so far behind. This meant my first delve into endgame content was near. To set myself up for Resonance Archives, I made a trek to the treasure hunter to the north and exchanged a tin bronze pickaxe for the map to the Resonance Archives. The treasure hunter was located in the sedimentary area, so I took this opportunity to look around for some lead. I would need this lead to make glass panes for my building project. I first looked for an easy surface deposit in the area and found a few. Once I ran out of the surface deposits, I followed with blind underground exploration for more. The result was a pretty decent amount of lead, enough for the project and then some. I made the journey back home and immediately started clay forming ingot molds. I didn't want to be splitting the smelting process between batches any longer. This meant forming an extra crucible and then stacking all of these clay goodies in the beehive kiln. The kiln was paying dividends in spades. I really appreciate the addition of this structure in the game. Next, I harvested the cattails that were littering the surrounding lake and crafted another batch of skeps. Then I harvested the beeswax one more time. Meanwhile, it was time to equip a winter set. It was getting really cold outside. I crafted the basic fur and rawhide set and threw in a straw hat. Nothing fancy, but it would do the trick for the most part. The leather was still cooking and I still had some time to kill. Thus, I started to clear the area for the upcoming project. I envisioned a rustic, castle-like structure in a letter L shape surrounding by fencing that will house various animals in my world. So I worked on flattening the area, chopping the trees, and plucking the shrubbery in preparation. When the ingot molds were ready to go, I fired up 2 crucibles full of lead and poured 50 ingots all at once. Meanwhile, I finally learned that you could literally stack the bricks up to the ceiling inside of the beehive kiln. I was also starting to produce other brick colors for a bit more variety. Finally, the batch of leather was done, and that meant I could craft myself a steel chainmail set to take to the Resonance Archives. It was time to get going. I grabbed only the essentials: food, bandages, and enough booze to get a whole army drunk. I wanted as much free space for loot as possible, thus I packed as lightly as I could. On the way to the archives, I suffered a near-death experience. I encountered possibly one of the longest drops ever into a deep-ass cave and only miraculously survived. On top of that, my winter set was failing me in this weather and I had to take campfire breaks to warm up. Eventually though, I made it to the entrance of the location. I staged the chest on the outside and down into the shaft I went. I knew this place very well by now and headed down the stairs, disposing of the local resistance. Engineering was my destination. Here, I stuffed the industrial furnace with the coal available nearby and lit the furnace with a torch. This restarted the ancient machinery and illuminated the dungeon. Next, I went to the noble headquarters. There was no particular reason to be here, but I went through every chest to get the fat loot. My inventory was filling up with clothes, jewelry, and other valuables. Next, I went to the commons. I mostly went to grab everything not nailed to the floor as well. I stopped by one of the rooms to kill the infamous Soul Blade Locust while checking every room for valuables too. Following, I ran to the Bell workshop to face the almighty Bell. I equipped my shield, threw down some torches on the ground, and started fighting the Bell. The Bell quickly summoned a whole army. While trying to fight said army, I picked up all my torches by accident, and the only thing keeping me from permanent darkness were the tiny locusts providing intermittent light. The fight didn't go as smoothly as I hoped, and I had to retreat a couple of times to heal. I didn't panic though. I brought enough healing for days, and I killed the Bell eventually. Before I could celebrate though, I had to escape the dungeon to sleep through a temporal storm. Too bad I forgot to bring a bed. So instead, I tried harvesting dry grass to make a hay bed on the fly. Except this area had hardly any grass to begin with. I was desperately trying to harvest enough while getting punted around by tier 4 drifters. This was a lot more dramatic than it needed to be. Eventually I had the bed and bypassed the storm. I returned to the archives and got back into the Bell workshop. Here I looted the big green gear as well as the elk medallion. The medallion would of course enable elk travel. I was excited for this development. I rushed back to the engineering to plug the big green gear into one of the machines. I also had to reload the furnace. The furnace already went out due to the surface detour. This enabled me to go to the translocator room, which took me to the flooded mine shafts. Here, I fought the local opposition, looked for valuable chests, and grabbed the ever-important pump part. The pump part belonged back at the engineering on top of one of the big spinning machines. This, of course, opened up the library, which took me to the immobilized Eidolon, the infamous tank and spank boss encounter. Taking him on with a shield and lots of bandages was a piece of cake. The boss's demise opened up the library door. I went inside and probed the ancient machine for knowledge and lore. Next, I grabbed the infamous glider schematic and proceeded to loot the living shit out of the library. I was escaping the archives with an absolute motherload of loot. Even the 16 slot carry-on chest was full at this point. I strapped it on my back and started the journey back. On the way home, I discovered that my world had a bunch of chunk errors. Weird, linear cutoffs were crisscrossing my seed. I wasn't sure what produced them, since these were newly generated chunks in this particular playthrough. Eventually, I made it home. I was cold, but at least in one piece. At home, I deposited all of the books from the library in my upstairs bedroom, and the rest of the loot went inside of the storage chests. The plan was to have everything on display one day, but that would have to be another video. I also tried on the best outfit looted from various archives chests. The overall look was pretty dope, too bad my chainmail hid all of its glory. Next, I stopped by the factory and restarted the steel making process. I smithed some iron nails and crafted the required elk gear, the saddlebags, and the bridle. Besides the required elk gear, I also had to purchase the actual elk. So I grabbed whatever gems I had in my chests and stopped by a few merchants. I managed to net about 50 gears from selling 4 gems. Now was the time to visit the treasure hunter up north again. The treasure hunter provided me with an elk for 50 gears and a map to the next destination. Except when I exited the cart, the elk was nowhere to be found. I panicked a bit, did some Reddit research, and then searched around for the elk until I found him squatting down a fair distance away from the cart. And, drumroll, it was an albino variant, supposedly a 2% chance. I swear I didn't cheat.
Wait a second. Something's not right here. You were just making it look like you were playing. You're a phony! Hey, this guy's a great big phony! That's right, you're a big fat phony!
I equipped the elk with all of the gear, mounted the beast, and tried to cross the immediate body of water. Here, I learned that the elk sucked at swimming, which was a shame. On land though, my new companion was quite speedy and had a step height of 2 blocks. This was a plus. Another minus though, the elk didn't do so well going through the trees and the forests. Before pushing any more endgame stuff, I wanted to make significant progress on my project. I was lacking a crucial material though, chalk. Thus, the Great Chalk Search had commenced. First order of business was to smith 14 steel plugs. This was a lot of steel to spend on the plugs, but to me it was worth the cost. The idea behind this was to stone quarry all of the sweet chalk I was about to find. Once again, I chose the southern direction since the other directions were a lot more explored. Looking for chalk on the elk involved riding through the environments while taking note of the surface rocks. I wasn't getting lucky though and kept on riding. About 6,000 blocks away from my base, while riding through a valley, I suddenly spotted something awfully white in a cave. I immediately backpedaled and saw that it was indeed chalk. This was an awesome discovery, of course. What wasn't awesome? The strata here was very shallow and my steel plugs would be extremely inefficient here. Instead, it made sense to simply mine the rock with a pickaxe. To be more space efficient, I found the nearest deposit of red clay. I was seeing the new 1.20 generation now in these unexplored chunks, hence the red clay. I dug out the red clay and combined with the stone to make chalk cobble, which was ultimately the block I wanted. I had a lot of extra storage space too. The new elk saddlebags offered 16 additional slots, while the X-Skills mod provided me with 5 additional slots from the survival skill category, which was a no-brainer point investment for me. I ran out of pickaxe durability way before I ran out of inventory. Should have brought more than 2 steel picks with me. Regardless, I proceeded home. The semi-long journey was helping me to get familiar with the elk riding prior to my grand journey. I made it back to the stage and chests and deposited the cobble. Next, I smelted a bunch of copper ingots in my house and took them to the smithy in my Megabuild. Here, I hammered out a series of copper plates to make copper lanterns. These lanterns would go towards supplying the light for the construction site. In the end, I had 17 lanterns to work with. Meanwhile, the next batch of steel was fully processed as well. So I busted down the coffins and extracted the blooms, which I worked on the helve hammers right after. I had a very healthy supply of steel ingots now, about 130 steel bars. This would last me a long time. I was almost ready to start building my new project, but I still needed glass. So I stopped by the quartz mine to fill up and got a boatload of bloomeries processing glass. This marked the official moment where I could commit to the build. I went to the staging area and started using the polished granite to outline the edges of the first building. The concept was fairly simple at heart. Build a bunch of modular houses that weren't complex on an individual level, but when put together would create an illusion of complexity. Once I had a segment of the wall done, I measured out the rectangular dimensions of the building and completed the opposite wall. I used the blue clay bricks on the front wall to give it a little more variety, and then started working on the overhang at the front. This first building was inspired by a simple barn design. It would have an open layout with food and water troughs for the animals. After adding a few support beams under the overhang, I started working on the rest of the wall. Most walls would be primarily made out of chalk cobblestone, with polished granite serving to create an outline. I left enough room for the window openings and placed a door in the back. After, I chiseled the back entrance to give it granite framing. Eventually, I started working on the granular detailing of the support beams with the chisel and made the overhang a lot thinner while cutting a pattern in the top. I also cut a few square openings into the brick wall. These portholes added a bit of depth to the build. Since gradients were a lot harder to achieve in Vintage Story, I used vines and the leaf blocks to add a weathered look to the building. I then started putting the glass panes into the window cutouts. Furthermore, I added small one-block windows adorned with trap doors. These sliding windows were a nice little touch. Next, I added an asymmetrical support beam to the overhang and chiseled the beams to have more interesting tie-ins into the overhang itself. I then used conventional fencing to create extra details. Following, I created watering troughs on each side of the barn using chiseled granite blocks. I then realized completing this project would be unattainable with this amount of details. I had to significantly scale down the process for the rest of the project. Next came a bunch of troughs in a side-by-side configuration inside of the barn. Finally, I slapped a couple of lanterns under the overhang and tied them into the overhang itself. Now I had officially completed a single structure in the upcoming build. It was nice to look at, but took too long. Time was becoming a bigger concern with each passing day. It also didn't help that going forward, I would need to spend a considerable amount of time making the area suitable for construction. After clearing out a big chunk of land, I had the dimensions of the next building laid out. I then proceeded to lay down the hardwood floor. This was funny, considering I had no intentions of doing anything with the interior for a while, but still, one day, every build in my world would have a functional interior. Although that would have to be saved for future episodes. Next, I laid out the frame of the building and the roof outline with more polished granite, continuing with the theme. By the end, it looks something like this. To make this building a little more exciting and a bit different from the barn, I added a T-shaped intersection to the structure. Once the general shape was decided on, I filled the walls with the chalk cobble. I was hoping to get all the basic shapes down first, while saving the detailing until the very end with whatever time I had left. I decided to continue using blue bricks for the top sections of the wall, a decision I would later reverse for a more uniform look. Soon, I finished the walls. I transitioned to making the roof next. First, I finished roofing the main section of the building, and then I completed the T-section, which I fused with the rest of the roof. After putting a few windows at the top, it looked something like this. Next, I started building the tower, which would be at the corner of my rustic farm. This was once again a very basic shape, a square. Once I had the outline figured out, it was just a matter of gradually building it up into the blue sky. The top of the tower would be adorned with a crown. At this point, it looked something like this, minus the side I forgot to finish. Next, I was going to switch directions with another building and start building to the west. This area was really uneven and thoroughly overgrown, thus I had to clear the trees and the shrubs and try to even the ground, which was a tall task. Once that was done, I put in the floor outline and installed the hardwood floors on the bottom. Once the floors were in, I started working on the frame of the house. This house would be squashed into the tower and would be uneven for a little variety. The frame looked something like this. Unfortunately, I had already ran out of chalk cobblestone at this point, and this is before finishing the walls of the squashed house. So I mounted my trusty elk and journeyed to get even more chalk cobblestone. Much like the last time, I stocked up on the red clay and then proceeded to mine the stone to combine into cobble. On the way back, I also stopped to get a bit more pine wood. My original supply was now almost exhausted due to the roofing requirements. With the resources renewed, I continued building. I finished the squashed house and then started working on the next attachment structure. This required a lot of land preparation once again, but soon I had the shape and the required space down. Then I repeated the familiar process of building the frame, filling the walls with cobblestone, and inevitably putting in the roof. The build still looked basic, but at least the general idea was starting to become apparent. Next, I built another similar structure using the exact same techniques. It was identical in dimensions and served as an extension to the previous house. Then I built a smaller attachment, which would be the last building in the series. I envisioned the smallest building being a chicken coop perhaps. The various modular shapes and structures were doing their job in creating an illusion of complexity. The basic outline of the project was done, and now I was going to add a fence around the perimeter. Hopefully you can now see what I was going for. After the fence was in, I started flattening the interior of the fence and removing the typical suspects, trees, shrubs, etc. Next, I started working on an exterior attachment that would span the perimeter of all the buildings, starting at the northern side by the barn. There would be a set of stairs starting at the building next to the barn that would allow access to this shelf. I used polished granite to frame the attachment shelf to give it a more solid look. To fill the walls, I decided to use blue bricks. I was already low on said bricks and thus decided to remove the bricks from the rest of the houses. I replaced them with regular cobblestone instead for consistency. Once I moved the bricks to the attachment wall, I put in a wooden overhang to cover the shelf. The overhang was done now, but it needed support beams, so I placed a bunch of placeholder beams for now. Next, I used the barn's overhang and copied the design to the shelf. Then I chiseled the placeholder beams and tied them into the overhang once again, using the ideas from the barn. The overhang and the attachment shelf were done now. However, I was starting to get worried about having time to finish the 1.20 endgame content. So I suspended the project for a time being and started getting ready for the grand journey. Whatever time would be left after the journey, I would spend finishing the rustic farm. I wasn't sure how much time that would be in reality though. I cooked meals to take with me, made bandages, packed out the essentials, and began the long elk journey to explore the new endgame. My first destination was the lazaret. The journey was frankly boring and uneventful. All of the locations ended up spawning on the same approximate latitude as my world's origin. Since my permanent base was not far removed from the origin, I didn't get to see any new biomes while traveling. Riding the elk over these huge distances was pretty frustrating too. There were many things the elk wasn't good at, mainly swimming and navigating through the thicket. So I had to avoid large bodies of water and forested areas of any kind. Eventually, after about 12,000 block ride, I managed to get to the X marked the spot. Here, I managed to find some grates that seemed to lead to yet another underground story location. Unfortunately, I couldn't go down that route since they were unbreakable, as was habitual for these locations. Confused, I searched around until I found the cave that led to the actual location entrance. I was met with lots of nasty drifters, as expected, but with firepower I was packing, it was quick work. Unfortunately, the drifters had a tendency of respawning quickly here, and I felt a little more rushed than I wanted to. The location itself didn't impress me. It was a lot less grandiose than the archives, and there was a lot less loot to be had down here. I picked up a few pieces that at first looked important, but were actually decorative in nature. Most other things were once again glued to the floors and the walls via the claim system. I fought to get downstairs, where I found a corpse containing the coordinates to the next location. Then I explored the rest of the downstairs while fighting off the monsters and collecting the decorative pieces. Eventually, I found what seemed to be a secret offshoot inside one of the shafts. This led me to a small underground river, which I navigated upstream to find yet another set of rooms. Inside of these rooms was a cool blue skull, which was probably the best piece of loot down here. This secret path led back into the main set of rooms afterwards. So once again, I had to fight myself out of the dungeon. Did I mention, monsters here constantly respawned. Regardless, I got out the same way I came in and rode the elk to the next location, the Nadia's village. The journey to the village was pretty uneventful yet again, filled with the same terrain, same biomes, and riddled with the same riding issues. After another 14,000 blocks, I saw the silhouette of the village at the edge of the map. It was fun to see a living, breathing outpost in vintage story. For once, this village looked like it could take care of itself. The settlement was behind a serious wall, but on the inside it was teeming with life and NPCs. Many of them had plenty of lore and exposition to dump on my lonely seraph. Some of the NPCs offered cool trades. Unfortunately, I only brought 50 rusty gears with me. I could only afford a couple of things. I spent my hard-earned doubloons on a couple of cool paintings from the arts dealer. Exploring the village was generally unrewarding though, as everything was claimed and nailed down to the floors and the walls. I managed to find a shaft that led to an underground passage, which in turn led to some outside rooms. Outside of the village, there were numerous farming fields that added a bit of realism to the outpost. Regardless, there was not much else to do here besides talk and trade, so I set off to the next destination, the Devastation. That's where the shit hit the proverbial fan. The journey once again was boring, although about halfway to the destination, I noticed menacing dark dome in the distance. This piqued my interest and created a sense of wonder. It reminded me a bit of Dalaran from vanilla World of Warcraft. Eventually, I reached the edge of the Devastation, which was marked by rusty red dirt and weird floating structures. It looked like a massive temporal bomb went off in this location, suspending everything in time and place. I also saw an ender a mechanical bird flying in the distance. It wasn't hard to guess that I would have more intimate encounter with whatever this thing was before too long. I demounted and used the temporal gear to set my spawn point on the edge of the Devastation just in case. I attempted to explore the area to the best of my ability. Immediately, that proved to be an extremely difficult proposition. The drifters here like to spawn relentlessly regardless of how fast I manage to kill them. There always seemed to be a train of baddies choo-chooing my way at any given time. Fighting them seemed futile, because as soon as I killed a drifter, 2 would take its place. I attempted to do parkour practice around the area, but that was also pointless. The ball turns were constantly disrupting my jumping flow and knocking me off the ledges. I scaled exactly one structure before I gave up on the idea of exploration, so I sprinted to the central structure instead, to the dreaded parkour tower. As soon as I reached the perimeter, I was granted a new ability. This ability allowed me to switch between the past, where things were in a mint condition, and the present, where things were in a state of total decay. Look, I was spoiled enough to know there was going to be a difficult jumping sequence here, so I created a new seed to practice this section before I dared attempting this in my actual save. Needless to say, this was a smart idea. There were a lot of problems with this section. Problem number 1. You had to memorize the layout in both timelines. Often, ledges would magically disappear underneath you when time shifting. Problem number 2. A mistake would often result in a complete restart from the bottom. Problem number 3. The jumping puzzles were hard to solve, and I started looking up the solutions almost right away. Look, I'm not much of a puzzle or platformer fan, so forgive me. Problem number 4. It was possible to die during the fall and lose your gear in a weird spot. Eventually though, I reached the boss, which was a gigantic mechanical bird. Here, problem number 5 reared its ugly head. I did not bring a bow, and this was a predominantly range fight. There was virtually no way to fight this boss with melee. It would land occasionally, but with a weird hitbox and short ground time, being able to hit him even a single time was never a given. The boss could also knock you off completely, leading to a splatter at the bottom of the tower. I guess I should have brought a glider with me as well. Another mistake I could not easily remedy in a reasonable manner. After all, I had 40,000 block ride home and another 40,000 ride back. I'm not going to lie, I was very close to abandoning this entire idea and returning home. There was always an option to attempt this in 1.21 when a nego had time to address the section. However, after practicing for a few hours, I decided to go for it. In my actual attempt, the parkour went reasonably well, with no deaths or horrendous failures. There was plenty of frustrating parts though, where I had to repeat certain jumps ad nauseum. However, the ascent was mostly drama-free, and I was at the boss in no time. The boss was also figured out. The time dodge allowed me to bypass any real threats. The boss would occasionally rain down his feathers on top of the platform. The feathers could be used as arrows and occasionally as spears. This allowed me to actually fight him, but it was slow, very, very slow. A lot of this had to do with the lack of night vision. The days were extremely short due to it being winter, and as soon as the dusk rolled in, the boss became virtually invisible, which meant I had to stand in the past timeline with a finger up my bum waiting for the dawn. Luckily, the boss did not regenerate his health. So, slow and steady, day after day, spear after spear, I whittled him down to half health, at which point the boss flew away, allowing me to loot the device in the middle. I had to take this device to Tobias in his cave. I hopped on my trusty elk, dished the devastation, and rode to the Tobias's cave. The journey was still quite long, and when I arrived, I couldn't find the entrance to the cave for the love of me. I even climbed the big hill and attempted to dig straight down. Soon, I encountered the impenetrable wall of the location and had to go back to plan A, finding the actual entrance. At the entrance, I encountered another issue. I could not mount the raft for some reason and had to swim through the glyph-adorned cave instead. The inside of the dwelling was super dope, lots of cool interior decor, bookshelves, chests, plants, chairs, tables, and even a fully functioning eidolon. Everything looked awesome and new. Tobias himself was another exposition dump NPC and gave me a lot of context to the story. He also gave me the details about constructing a rickety teleporter that would eventually allow me to visit him on demand. Too bad that would require a lot of parts and assembly first. There was also no continuation to the story just yet, since this was a brand new update and future content did not exist. This was a hard cutoff point, a cliffhanger if you may. That of course meant that I had no other choice but to ride home. The ride home was where my frustration with the elk really grew beyond belief. In my opinion, riding for over 40,000 blocks with no stop gaps in between was always a big ask. All the same issues cropped back up and amplified. Crossing bodies of water was painful, trees made visibility extremely limited, the forests sometimes felt impenetrable, falling into the caves was not fun and required extensive labor to get out. Granted, I did not know about the bone flute at this time. I even got my elk killed from fall damage at one point. Luckily, you could simply heal it with bandages. Slowly but surely, I made it back to my kingdom though. I was happy to be done with the travel at this point. I was back at home and had about a month to go before the end of another 100 days. As I alluded earlier, I would exclusively dedicate this time to finishing my project. First though, I deposited all of the trophies in my bedroom. Like I said, eventually I would have a museum for all of this junk, but for now, my bedroom would do. Once I returned to my project, I started working on the courtyard. I split the southeastern corner with a fence first. I made a big opening in the middle of the wall to give it a bit of extra flair. Eventually, the internal structure of the buildings would connect in some sensible way. For now, these extra openings were mostly for show. I then created the porthole openings on the walls of the shelf. These details were small, but combined still gave my build enough variance to create extra interest. Next, I moved all of the staging chests and the materials to this new subsection of the courtyard. Now, I was ready to start giving the walls that weathered look. A few vines here, a couple of leaves there. A couple of small details like extra tool racks all gave it a more interesting appearance. After all, this was a farm. It needed to look like there was some work being done here. This was the current appearance. Next, I worked on making the edge of the shelf look a little more interesting. Then, I extended the fence in the courtyard section. After extending the courtyard, I placed a few more embellishments there. The animal cages I used earlier were a good decor piece. Plus, a ton of barrels was always a good little detail anywhere. Eventually, I would introduce even more variety with other chiseled props, but for now, I had to move on. From one staircase on the left side of the shelf to the right staircase on the right side, I laid some path blocks. I had never used them before, but they increased the player speed by 33%. I suppose I should have been using them already, but it was never too late to start as my kingdom expanded. Next, I started working on one of the right side buildings. First, I put some polished stone down in front of it. Then, I created another overhang similar to the one in the barn. I chiseled it to size and placed a few lanterns underneath the overhang to go along with the windows on the first floor. Time was rapidly running out on me, and I only had a few things in mind to finish. I crafted a bunch of crates and placed them around the build for extra detail. I then added some leaves on the roofs for similar effect. Following, I started placing vines on the walls of the tower with a bit of pillaring. Once I climbed all the way to the top, I worked on the crown a little. With the tower fixed up and finished, I moved on to working on a small attachment house on the west side. This would eventually be a chicken coop. I placed compacted soil down, cut a few windows, and placed 2 entrances in the wall. With the coop done, I started sectioning the areas for different animals to roam free. Once these sections were delineated, I directed the piggies to slowly transfer out of the original pen and into their new environment with a bit of fencing. I then removed any traces of the original enclosure. Soon, all the piggies were in their new home. Hopefully, they were pleased with their new accommodations. Since I only had a couple of bighorns, I transferred them with cages by hand. Next, I had an idea of making the roof of the smooshed house a little more interesting with a window cutout. The window cutout would have an overhang above it. At first, I went with the square overhang before settling on a triangular shape. These small details were adding up to a cool build. Finally, I chiseled a chimney and attached it behind one of the houses. I had way more ideas for extra detailing, but time had officially ran out. Similar to the last episode involving my mega build, I simply decided to push it out to another day. There would be an episode dedicated to polishing my current structures, both exterior and interior, but not today. Meanwhile, I already spent close to 80 hours in the Plains and Valleys world and was ready to take a break. I love this place, but it would have to take a time out until I felt rejuvenated to come back. Hard to believe, but another 100 days are done in the Plains and Valleys world. If you're still here, I love you. This is the most time I have ever spent on a single world, whether in Minecraft or Vintage Story. Want to see a 400-day episode? Let me know in the comments. I still read and reply to every single one of you beautiful messages. As for this episode, the endgame content was interesting. I made a dedicated video about it and even interviewed a Nego Studios builder to get his take. If you are curious, it's the 2 videos prior to this one on the channel. Maybe I should have waited for 1.21 before diving into the endgame, but oh well. I've already got an idea for the next episode, though it might be a bit radical. Truthfully, I'm a little disappointed with how this world turned out. If I could press a redo button, I'd change quite a few settings. Shorten the pole to equator distance, reduce the distance between story locations, and go for a proper continental world with real oceans. Unfortunately, as far as I know, you can't just tweak these settings and regenerate the chunks after the seed had already been created. So I've been toying with the idea of copying the lake area, my builds, and the surrounding mountains, then pasting it all into a new continental map and blending the terrain. No idea how feasible that is or what the side effects of that might be, but when the time comes, I'll let you vote on it. My next video will be a departure from the usual 100 days format. I'm experimenting with the new tools, a camera count for overhead shots, time lapses, a script featuring a role-played character, and a slight departure in music choices. I want to push the boundaries of what these videos can be, and each one teaches me something new as a creator. In the meantime, I might drop a quick feeler video, probably a mod recommendation roundup of some sort. Then, I'll dive into editing another Retro Bangers episode, this time on my second favorite retro game, XCOM 2. After that, it's right back for more vintage story content, more 100 days, more plains and valleys, more vintage voices. Keep on the lookout for the community posts for more info. And on that note, Oscillascape is beaming out.